On the morning of April 14, 1847, a thin column in the St. Charles Herald slipped past most eyes, a sliver of type wedged between advertisements for cotton gins and cough elixirs. It read, "Missing, Mrs. Evelyn Duval, wife of plantation owner Gerard Duval. Last seen on the evening of April 10th. Reward offered for information leading to her safe return." It looked routine, the sort of notice that dries quickly on a page and fades from memory. But the ground it fell on was anything but routine. The Duval plantation stood along a slow bend of the Mississippi, a two-story white mansion held aloft by 12 columns that announced wealth, the way cannon announce war, loudly, confidently, and from a distance. In ledgers and parish minutes, this was a place of order. Cane in tidy rows, profits climbing, rules clarified. Gerard Duval had taken possession in 1839 after his father's death, then expanded the acreage, improved the mill machinery, and advocated publicly for tighter controls on the movement of the enslaved. On paper, he was discipline made flesh. Inside the house, discipline had a different name, silence. Evelyn came from Charleston in 1844, the carefully arranged bride in a marriage designed to braid fortunes together. Society columns praised her refinement and beauty. Portraits showed a composed young woman with a delicate mouth and a guarded gaze. Her private letters told another story. "The air here suffocates," she wrote to a cousin. "The house is a museum where I am both exhibit and visitor." The line lodged like a thorn. An exhibit can be admired, but it cannot move. Days on the plantation were measured and predictable. Dawn inspections, midday accounts, the clatter of dishes, the chiming of crystal, the lamp in the library kindled at dusk. The manager kept a weather journal, the overseer a daily report. The First Bank of New Orleans kept neat columns of profit and debt. Everything had its place, yet what never made it into any book was the feeling that gathered in corners, the hush at the curve of the staircase, the stop-start footfalls outside the library, the way conversations thinned when certain names arose. April 10th arrived carrying weather. The plantation's ledger of sky and wind recorded heavy rain beginning at sunset, continuing through the night. The overseer's report noted that Gerard departed for New Orleans on business. Expected return in 3 days. Kitchen heat met storm-cooled air. Steam-wreathed iron pots. Somewhere between thunder and teacups, the library lamps burned later than usual. The cook would later say that at about 8 o'clock, Mrs. Duval requested tea in the library. By morning, she was gone. A disappearance is never only an absence. It is also a summons. By April 17th, the Daily Crescent reported 50 men with dogs, scouring swamps and roads. Boats nosing along muddy banks where willow branches trailed like fingers searching for a pulse. Notices reached as far as Natchez and Mobile. The official word settled fast. Abduction, as if the concept had been waiting in the hall, hat in hand, for someone to call it in. A reward offered, a culprit implied. But even at the beginning, the narrative thinned in places like paper held to flame. The library had been in unusual use that week. Certain books were missing. A maid remembered, then hesitated. The steward's weather note had a smudge where the ink bled. Rain or a hand that shook. None of it was proof. All of it was smoke. As the search parties pushed into cypress shade, the house kept its posture. Columns tall, shutters shut, a face that would not betray what the rooms had seen. Yet the quiet had weight now, as if the very timbers were listening. That morning's prints in the softened earth blurred by noon. Doors that usually complained on their hinges seemed newly careful, as though they too had secrets to protect. Later chapters would argue and counter-argue. Runaway or ruse, love or violence, escape or cover-up. But chapter 1 is simpler, and for that reason more unsettling. It is only the moment the story tilts, a newspaper line, a lamp that burns longer than it should, a husband away, rain drilling steadily at the eaves, and a woman who steps, willingly or unwillingly, out of the role the world assigned her. What remains at day's end is an inventory that does not add up. One mistress unaccounted for, a room that smells faintly of damp paper and bergamot, a storm that has washed the edges off every footprint, and a question that will not sit still. Was this disappearance a crime to be solved, or a boundary crossed in the only way possible? The notice in the Herald said missing. The house, if it could have spoken, might have chosen a different word. Perhaps departed, perhaps taken, perhaps merely gone. And with gone, every other certainty begins to loosen. That is the whole of it for now. The rest waits in the rain-heavy dark, where the river slides on and the lamps in the library flicker like a thought someone almost dared to say aloud. The story that appeared in the newspapers was very simple. A celebrated match between a Charleston belle and a rising Louisiana planter. Announcements in neat florid type described the pairing as both prudent and felicitous, as if the union were a well-balanced ledger rather than two human lives. The carriages, the lace, the rice, society recorded those. It did not record what the world felt like once the last ribbon was boxed and the last guest gone. The way the new bride stared at her reflection and tried to name the person in the glass. The arrangement had been struck in offices, not parlors. Evelyn's father tallied ships and timbers. Gerard counted acres and cane. Between them they drew the outline of a promise. Capital would cross the water as surely as sugar crossed the season, and a daughter would ensure that the handshake became blood. Evelyn was not asked whether the idea of a river she had never seen, and a stranger's house under an unfamiliar sun, thrilled her or terrified her. She understood the arithmetic of her world. Her yes was needed only to dress the decision already made. Charleston soothed by habit, salt on the air, church bells threading the day. There she had friends who talked in the shorthand of girlhood, and mothers who signaled whole arguments with a glance over a fan. She left that weather behind in 1844, as cargo leaves a harbor, carefully packed, nominally protected, and never fully consulted. The voyage felt longer than the map promised. On deck at dusk, she practiced saying Louisiana, until the syllables stopped feeling like a foreign word. By the time the river swallowed the horizon, the name fit her tongue but not her chest. First impressions make good liars. The Duval house, white and orderly, staged itself like a portrait, columns squared to the road, windows serene, the entire facade a theorem about control. Gerard presented it with an owner's satisfaction, one hand open as if offering, and the other poised at his back as if reserving the right to reclaim. He was a man of careful strength, courteous in company, sparing of praise, allergic to mess. His smile was a shudder. It opened just enough to suggest warmth, then closed to keep the interior from view. Inside, the architecture continued its thesis. Rooms arranged by function and rank, clocks that chimed agreement. Evelyn learned the distances. How many steps from the morning room to the veranda, 46. How many from her dressing table to the library's north shelf, 61. How many words she could say about weather and parish improvements before Gerard's gaze slid away. Fewer than one might suppose. She learned the calendar too. Balls, suppers, charity drives arranged to be acceptable rather than generous. Sunday sermons that congratulated order and cautioned against appetite, spoken in a tone that could have preserved fruit. The house offered tasks to fill the hours and rules to thin the blood. She wrote gracious notes. She approved menus heavy with what the river and the fields gave up. She hosted visitors who arrived with tidings and left with the sense that nothing need change. These were the visible duties of a mistress. The invisible ones were more exacting. To accept absence as decorum, to translate quiet into virtue, to smile at the right temperature. The performance had a costume, silk stitched to hobble rather than free, and a script that left little room for ad-libbing. She could not always remember when she had agreed to be an actress. Letters became the space where her voice expanded. She wrote to her cousin in Virginia as if ink might smuggle air. "The house is a museum," she confessed, "where I am both exhibit and visitor." The line came to her in a moment of clarity she did not know whether to celebrate or fear. Exhibits are labeled. They are positioned for other people's understanding. Visitors, even admiring ones, are temporary. To be both at once was to live always under a gaze and never fully at home. Gerard wasn't cruel in the ways that make good gossip. He did not carouse. He did not squander. He did not bruise what would show. His severity was architectural. He believed in straight lines and the moral geometry of hierarchy, in a plantation that hummed like a well-wound clock, because each cog, man, woman, child, kept to its appointed revolution. He could speak with charm when the parish needed charming, and with iron when the point required weight. If he ever loved anything purely, the evidence lived in ledgers and on shelves, books maintained like a private regiment, bindings dressed in leather, spines aligned as if awaiting inspection. Evelyn learned to navigate him as one navigates weather, by reading barometers invisible to others. The angle at which he set his glass, the precise length of pause before he answered a question, the topics that made his diction sharpen, accounts, machinery, the folly of those who mistook sentiment for principle. When she tried to introduce a softness, a charity idea that involved teaching letters, a musical evening that would mix guests across boundaries, he listened until she brushed the edge of his order. Then the shutter smile returned, and the idea was civilly unmade. What does a clever woman do with a day that belongs to other people? She collects small sovereignties. Evelyn gathered hers in the library. It began innocently, cataloging, a polite word for the humble labor of restoring another person's possessions to a system. Titles were shifted, dust coaxed from edges, French grouped and then ungathered to make way for translations. In the margins of Rousseau and Voltaire she traced faint pencil leaves. Not arguments, not yet, only a record of where her eye had rested. The books did not loosen the world's laws, but they breathed differently than the room did. And sometimes that was enough. Society visited, women in gauze and men with news. The Fontaine family came often, Margaret with her precise observations wrapped in compliments. "You are so composed, Mrs. Duval," she said once, kindly meaning it. Evelyn smiled and filed the word away. Composed, as if she were a letter waiting to be posted to a destination she had not chosen. At Christmas, Margaret noted in her journal that Evelyn seemed distracted during the sermon, and excused herself before the meal. The entry survived. The reason did not. Perhaps the hymn pressed a bruise? Perhaps she simply needed a corridor with no eyes in it. The marriage itself behaved like a lesson memorized by both pupils. In public they were fluent. In private they spoke in drafts. Gerard, when pleased, was generous with silence. When displeased, he was generous with reason. He believed explanations should suffice for comfort. It puzzled him when they did not. Evelyn learned to keep questions small and precise, to avoid the ones whose answers she already knew would be refusals. When refusals came, they arrived wrapped in care. It would not do. It will cause unease. It is not the way here. She discovered how suffocation can wear a gentleman's cologne. If there were fissures, they started as hairlines. A request denied without the courtesy of a pretext. A look from a husband who had discovered a book moved by a hand not his. A note of irritation when the library lamps burned later than custom allowed. She marked these like a mapmaker marks shoals, places to avoid if possible, places where storms lectured the shoreline. In the mirror, her face stayed calm, but her posture grew careful, the way one stands on a floor that may conceal a trapdoor. Beyond the house, the fields performed their obedience. Cane rose bent, rose again, the mill ground sweetness from stalk and season. The enslaved people who made this possible moved under rules written by men who feared their breath, their minds, their unseeable futures. Evelyn discovered that proximity to power does not guarantee the power to change it. Sometimes it merely clarifies how little one has. She tried to give what she could where she could. An extra cloth here, a softened instruction there, knowing both the insufficiency and the risk. Consolations, like contraband, travel best in small packages. There were evenings when the river sounded like an answer. From the veranda, the water looked patient, a language that did not need permission to move. She thought of Charleston then, the pull of tide, the permission of horizon, and of the woman she might have been there if decisions had bent a different way. Imagination is its own kind of travel. It cost nothing to picture a room where no one waited to hear whether she had obeyed. It cost a great deal to stop picturing it. To say that Evelyn didn't love Gerard is too simple and too modern. Love in her world was braided with duty, until neither could be cleanly separated. She respected parts of him. She feared parts of him. She understood him in the way a musician understands a metronome, grateful for the tempo, resentful of the tyranny. If she longed for anything, it was a conversation that did not end at the border of propriety. The chapter might end here, with a woman measuring her life by hallways and calendars. But the library would not let it. Books call companions the way bells call services. A catalog needs hands. A system needs a mind. It was considered useful then that a literate man, a recent purchase, was assigned to assist in house matters, particularly the care of the collection. The notation was unusual, but it spared the planter time, and so it was allowed. No one asked what else it might allow. That is the hinge. The house did not change. The columns did not bend. But the air in the library altered by a degree too fine for thermometers. It began with the inventory of titles and ended. No, not ended. Began again, with the inventory of selves that two people conduct when they speak honestly, in a room designed to keep honesty out. Later, the world would call this scandal crime, tragedy, legend. For now, it is only this: a marriage that looked complete from the road, and inside it a woman who discovered that the most dangerous act is not disobedience, but recognition. The museum metaphor held. Exhibits are moved sometimes, temporarily for light and preservation. Visitors are asked to follow the arrows. Evelyn had followed them dutifully. In the spring of 1846, she paused at a gap in the rope and wondered, not for the first time, what would happen if she stepped through. The entry was small, almost shy, tucked at the bottom of a ledger page. January 1846. Henry Carter. Male, approximately 26. Literate, carpenter, of sound body and temperament. Assigned to house. To manage library. In a world that measured value in muscle and obedience, the word literate glinted like a stray coin on a dirt road. Someone had tried to pocket it. Someone else, perhaps out of vanity, perhaps foresight, let it remain. He came quietly, as people do who have learned that quiet can be armor. Strong without boasting, watchful without challenge. His hands held the biography of his life. Old scars at the knuckles from work that bit back. A fine tremor at rest that vanished the moment he touched wood or leather. He did not appear to take up more room than a man must. And yet the rooms altered around him. The way a chord changes when you add a single true note. The first time Evelyn saw him, she noticed, because she noticed everything, the way his gaze moved. Not skittish, not bold, but alive, as if reading were something he did to space itself. He waited at the library threshold with the deference drilled into him, head slightly bowed, eyes not. "Mr. Carter," she said, testing the sound of respect in a house that had no place for it. He lifted his eyes then, and for a second each of them recognized the other not as role, but as person. It was the kind of recognition that a well-run household files under danger. The work began with dust and order. Carter repaired shelves that had sagged under the weight of Gerard's ambitions. He fitted a new strip of leather to the atlas whose spine had split along Africa. He sorted the French philosophers by century, then by subject, then, at her request, by the sort of problem they believed a book might solve. Evelyn watched his hands learn the library's temperament, which volumes asked to be coaxed, which endured being told. Conversation arrived by stealth. A question about a title, then two. Remark, Rousseau writes as if the world will forgive him anything because he has confessed it. That made her look up. A reply, and sometimes the world does. That made him smile just at the corner of his mouth. Rules hovered, audible to both. No opinions that smelled like equality, no ideas that could scratch the furniture of order. They spoke anyway. The way people breathe near a window the house has forgotten how to close. Knowledge, shared, is a kind of contraband. He revealed it a sliver at a time. He had learned letters in places where punishment patrols the margins. A preacher who believed in saving souls with syllables. A foreman who valued neat numbers enough to look the other way when a boy's eyes followed shapes on a page. Night hours spent tracing words by memory in the air like prayers no one could confiscate. He did not say it all at once. He did not need to. The sentences he formed had the careful strength of a bridge someone built in secret and tested alone. Evelyn, who had been told her whole life that reading would refine her, discovered what it could also do: unmake the walls, or at least show where the seams were. Discussions in that room were never abstract. The house made sure of that. A paragraph about the social contract would be interrupted by the clink of keys on a ring in the corridor. A sentence about liberty would thin at the sound of boots measuring the hallway. They learned to read and to listen at once, to close a book not only to keep it from dust, but to save themselves from being seen inside it. The library's lamp learned their schedule. Light later than customary, shutters drawn against weather and witness. Once while rain drummed its patient code on the shutters, Carter described how wood remembers, how humidity swells it, how heat coaxes it back, how even when it looks unmarked, it keeps a record of seasons in its grain. People are not so different, Evelyn said, and then feared her own boldness. He did not answer immediately. His attention rested briefly on the bruise at her wrist she had not successfully hidden. "No, ma'am," he said at last very evenly. "They are not." The trouble began, as it often does, with someone else's impatience. In early March, the overseer found Carter in the mistress's sitting room, a book in his hand and a conversation still warm in the air. The entry in the ledger was neat and punitive. Disciplinary action required. The reassignment to field labor came swift and public, a reminder to every eye that the house was a privilege, and privilege could be revoked. The next days in the library felt like absence. The shelves stood correct and indifferent. The atlas did not open itself. Evelyn asked Gerard carefully to return Carter to his duties. She marshaled the arguments that her world allowed a woman. Convenience, efficiency, the propriety of a library managed by someone trained to the work. He listened with the patience of a man waiting to deliver the answer he had already chosen. "It is not seemly," he said, and the word slid across the room like a bolt. "The field is where he belongs." He did not look at her as he talked about belonging, but something in the house had shifted and, uncharacteristically, Gerard relented a week later. The notation was almost petulant. At Mistress's insistence, H.C. returned to library management. The walls knew what that meant, even if the calendar pretended not to. Evelyn knew too, though she dared not name it outside the shelter of her own head. Not desire alone, that would have been easier to resist, but affinity, an equality the house could not tolerate. It is one thing to share a room with a man. It is another to share a language. When Carter returned, he returned altered. Polite as ever, quieter if that were possible. The mark of field labor does not wash off in a single night. He carried the weight of it the way wood carries weather. He resumed repairs, but with the vigilance of someone who has counted the cost of a misstep and found the sum exacting. If before he had looked around the library with careful wonder, now he surveyed it like a man mapping escape routes. Door, window, the new stickiness at the latch that might slow a hand. They moved to caution without speaking of it. Conversations shortened. References hid in shorthand. The Genevan for Rousseau. The Exile for Voltaire. The map for the Atlas whose pages they secretly traced with futures they did not yet admit. She adopted the habit of leaving a book crooked by one finger's width when the corridor outside was clear, straightening it flush when footsteps approached. He learned the arrangement of her face the way he learned the weight of hammers, which muscles meant safe to speak, which meant silence until the hinge of the door announced neutrality. Margaret Fontaine noticed what the house tried to smother. In her neat journal hand, she recorded that Evelyn had become quiet to the point of invisibility, and yet her eyes seemed to take in everything. On Christmas, she watched Evelyn excuse herself from a sermon that praised order as if it were grace. Margaret did not write down the bruise, perhaps because friendship in that world could only shelter so much without shattering. The first true warning came not in ink, but in gaze. Gerard saw them together one afternoon. Nothing improper in the scene if you thought of propriety as furniture. A mistress at the library table, a servant with a tray of newly mended volumes. But propriety for Gerard was geometry, angles and distances. He measured something in the air between them that could not be squared. His eyes cooled. Later that evening he mentioned the library lamps burning late. He was smiling when he mentioned it. The smile did not reach his hands. There are points beyond which stories tilt because gravity insists. In late March, something invisible crossed. Perhaps it was the moment Evelyn failed to hide the way her voice steadied when she said Carter's name. Perhaps it was the moment Carter, half a beat too slow, looked at Gerard instead of through him. Perhaps it was nothing so dramatic as a moment. Perhaps it was only the accumulation of small accuracies. a woman learning the dimensions of her cage, a man who had taught himself to read, learning what else he could learn. In another house, in another country, this would be where a confession arrives, clean and declarative. But nothing about their world permitted honesty to be simple. What came instead were arrangements made in the language of compulsion, a note tucked beneath a book's paste-down, where a knife had lifted the paper and replaced it so neatly that only a librarian or a carpenter would detect the seam. A meeting timed for when the mill machinery drowned ordinary sound, an understanding that if they were to speak freely, they must do it as people do who are already fugitives, whether or not they have yet crossed a border. It was Evelyn who named the risk first, softly, as if afraid the syllables might set the curtains alight. "If we continue," she said, "we will continue somewhere else or not at all." Carter stood very still, the way he did when measuring twice before cutting once. "Somewhere else," he said at last, not as a dream but as a plan. Plans have anatomy, a calendar nerve, a compass bone. Gerard's business trips were as regular as tides. The riverboat schedules were predictable if you knew whom to ask. The city, New Orleans, was a map of threats and possibilities, with pockets where money could make papers and other pockets where money meant nothing. Carter knew some of those pockets by reputation. He knew a man who knew a man. He knew the kind of silence you could buy and the kind you couldn't. They rehearsed their future in small acts of defiance that looked, from a distance, like tidiness. A satchel left in the library closet with spare binding cloth on the tag, which was true, but not the whole truth. Coins folded into the hem of a petticoat for church alms, a carpenter's, rule cleaned and tucked into a drawer where Gerard never looked because he had never needed to make a straight line. Himself, when the punishment came, for of course it came in gestures that pretended to be about efficiency and decorum. Carter was reassigned again, briefly, then summoned back again at mistress's insistence. Each change increased the risk. Each return forged an argument against fear. If we can survive this, perhaps we can survive the rest. But fear is patient, it waits. It accumulates like minutes at the end of a too long day, heavy and unavoidable. One evening, rain rehearsed itself on the horizon. The library windows turned to mirrors. Their reflections looked like people they might have been under kinder laws. "Wood remembers," he had said. So do people. Evelyn's memory offered two futures and held them both by the throat. In one she remained, becoming the composition everyone praised, polished, brittle, preserved. In the other, she stepped into a world that would not forgive her and might not let her live, but would at least be hers. Carter closed the atlas gently and slid it home. 3 days, he said. Gerard's standard absence for business. The morning boat is the least watched if the weather's bad. The plan, spoken aloud, felt smaller and more possible than the silence that had preceded it. Outside the door, the house breathed its usual measured breath. Inside they held still, listening to corridors, to footsteps, to their own hearts. 2 metronomes arguing with a clock. The chapter ends where all plans must begin. Not with the escape, not with discovery, but with a sentence that turns decision into direction. 3 days, she repeated. 3 days, he said, and the lamp, as if it understood, burned a little steadier. The first warning did not arrive as thunder. It came as a correction in a ledger. March 3rd. Disciplinary action required for Henry C., found in mistress's private sitting room. The sentence was the size of a thumbnail, but it carried the weight of a door slowly closing. In a house where every distance had been measured and approved, the overseer had found 2 people on the wrong side of a line, and he wrote the discovery down in the only language the system respected, accounting. By noon the same day, Carter was on the yard, a hammer replaced by a hoe. The library exchanged for the glare of a field. Men whose backs already knew the son's grammar watched the transfer without comment. Silence was the only safe applause. Evelyn felt the absence of him the way a violinist feels a missing string. Every note was suddenly work. She stood in the library doorway, the smell of leather and dust intact, and understood that the room had lost a temperature only 2 people could register. She tried the arguments available to her station. At supper, she named efficiency as virtue, the bindings in need of repair, the inventory incomplete, the impropriety of leaving a gentleman's volumes to the weather. Gerard listened, folding his napkin with the exactness of a man who trusts geometry more than mercy. "It is not seemly," he said, a verdict masquerading as advice. "He belongs in the field." The word belongs lay on the table like a length of chain. Nights that followed took on the thinness of watching. Evelyn measured them by the sounds she could not bear and those she strained to hear. The rivers beat against the bank. The mill's teeth worrying cane into sugar. The echoes of boots in corridors where doors learned to whisper shut. She wrote a letter and did not send it. She straightened books no one else would notice were crooked. She slept only when dawn had exhausted itself against the shutters. On March 21st, a second entry appeared, brisk and punitive. H.C. reassigned to field duties as punishment. The house sighed, satisfied. The order of things had been restored. 2 days later, the library took on the air of a sealed exhibit again, its lamp cold by 7, its window catching only the ordinary evening. It should have ended there if houses deferred to ink. But houses defer to will. On March 28th, a counterline in that same hand, nettled and tidy. At mistress's insistence, H.C. returned to library management. If anyone was surprised, they performed the surprise in private. The overseer responded with vigilance. Gerard with charm that thinned when the topic turned toward night lamps and reading after hours. Evelyn said nothing more on the subject because the price of the last insistence had been steep enough. She had felt something in her husband go quiet. The dangerous quiet that precedes a storm. Carter returned differently, not in body, which remained careful and strong, but in posture. Field labor had a way of rattling loose whatever the house pretended to confer. He worked as before, mending spines, sorting shelves, matching titles to their temperaments. Yet he counted the exits when he entered a room. He learned the hinge that stuck on damp days, the sill that sang under weight, the distance from library to back stairs when you did not want the corridor to know you had passed. They adjusted their speech to the new weather. Names became codes. Rousseau the Genevan, Voltaire the exile. The atlas was the map. The satchel in the closet, sewn with coins and spare linen under a label reading binding cloth, was the kit. They assembled a small vocabulary of survival and wore it under the skin like a second pulse. Warnings multiplied. Somewhere between sermons and supper calls, Margaret Fontaine wrote in her journal that Evelyn had become so quiet, one nearly forgot she was in the room. And yet her eyes, when they moved, took the measure of everything. Margaret's words would survive. Her caution, offered delicately on a veranda where mosquitoes stitched the dusk, did not. "Be mindful," she said, meaning more and less than the phrase aloud. "People notice what they are taught to be afraid of," the overseer noticed. Twice he found reasons to pass the library at uncustomary hours. The second time, pausing long enough to leave a fingerprint in the dust on the wainscot. He began to appear in places where he had no work to do, his keys clinking a tune that sounded like ownership. He smelled preparation the way a hound smells weather. Gerard noticed, too, in subtler ways. He remarked upon the neatness of the library, a compliment shaped like a hook. He mentioned that the lamps consumed more oil than in previous months, then smiled as if the words were a joke he had told on himself. He asked casually how the new bindings held, and when Evelyn answered with more detail than a hostess usually would, his gaze went briefly out of focus, as if he were listening to another conversation behind hers. The third warning was not a line in a book or a sentence at supper. It was a bruise, the color of spoiled fruit, high on Evelyn's wrist where a sleeve could hide it poorly. Carter saw it when she reached for a volume gone brittle at the hinge. He did not name it. Naming is a luxury of safety. He only placed the repaired atlas on the table and spoke of weather. Humidity swells wood. Heat brings it back. Remembers both, she answered in the same language. People too. A plan is not born whole. It accretes. This one formed around fixed points. Gerard's departures, 3 days. The riverboat schedules, dawn, less watched in rain. The city. Pockets of risk that could be crossed if you knew which eyes to avoid and which to buy. Carter tested the edges quietly. He spoke with a man who sold rope and knew the price of silence. With a woman who laundered for a priest who wrote letters for people who could not be seen writing letters. No one said the word papers. No one needed to. They practiced leaving under the guise of order. The satchel's weight became familiar to a closet hook. Coins stitched into a hem were blessed in public as alms. The carpenter's rule, cleaned and wrapped, sat in a desk where Gerard never looked because he had never had to measure anything he could not command. Evelyn learned which dresses read as invisible and which read as statement. She stitched a dark veil into a pocket of her traveling cloak, then unstitched it, then stitched it again with smaller thread. And yet, even as the plan sharpened, another future hovered, the one in which discovery came first. Rumors travel like vines, a kitchen whisper about a mistress who lingered in the library, a yardman's observation that a literate carpenter walked straighter lately, as if an invisible load had shifted from shoulder to mind. A coachman who heard the overseer ask, too pleasantly, about morning fog on the river. Each scrap on its own was nothing. Together they bound a hedge around two people and waited to catch them. Late March poured itself into early April. Rains rehearsed and then committed. The Plantation's weather book, faithful and impersonal, noted heavy showers at dusk. Barometer falling. Evelyn's pulse matched it. She counted plates at supper and thought of boat schedules. She listened to prayers and thought of doors. When she rose from her pew on Easter Sunday, Margaret reached for her hand and found it cold. "You will catch a chill," Margaret said. "I already have one," Evelyn answered, too softly to be catalogued as defiance. The last warning before the night itself came unasked. Gerard stood in the library doorway, not entering, as if the threshold might stain him. "Do close earlier," he said lightly. "The servants grow lazy when the house doesn't sleep." His eyes took the measure of light, of dust, of distance. He did not look at Carter, who had left an hour earlier, but every muscle in his face suggested an inventory being taken. After he was gone, the room felt narrower, as if the air had learned to brace. Evelyn closed the atlas and slid it home, not trusting her hands to be steady. She moved to the window and lifted the latch half an inch, the agreed signal that the corridor was clear. No footsteps, only rain stitching the night to the ground. 3 days, she whispered. A rehearsal that tasted like a vow. Carter, in his quarters, traced the map in the dark with a carpenter's patience. Door. Hall stairs, yard, gate, path, landing, river, city. He slept in fractions. He woke before dawn, as men do who expect to be asked to prove their courage to a morning that will not care whether they succeed. Warnings had done their work. The plan was no longer a possibility. It was a clock, and clocks once wound will insist. Rain arrived early and without discussion, hammering the roof until the house sounded hollow, like a drum announcing a dance no one had practiced. The weather book, faithful clerk of other men's decisions, would later write, "Heavy showers at sunset, continuing through the night." The description would be true and also not nearly enough. At 7, the house moved in its practiced steps. Lamps were trimmed, shutters latched, dinner trays cleared with the choreography of a staff that could do it blindfolded. At 8, the cook climbed the back stairs with a tray, china rattling, bergamot teasing the steam. "For the library," she said to no one in particular, though the air in the corridor seemed to lean closer to listen. She knocked once, twice. The door opened. A soft thank you. The tray went in. The cook came out. Small as it was, this was the last ordinary act the house would witness for some time. Some nights tipped by degrees, one choice, then another, the future setting like glue. This one did not bother with degrees. It arrived already decided. The signal, a half-inch lift of a window latch, waited in the dark like a held breath. The satchel, labeled binding cloth, hung where it always hung but suddenly weighed what it had weighed in imagination for weeks. Coins slept in seams. A dark veil, folded twice, tucked itself into the inner pocket of a traveling cloak. Evelyn moved through the library, touching nothing and everything, a thief in her own life. Across the yard, Carter lay dressed on his pallet, not sleeping so much as timing. He had learned the overseer's patrol as a musician learns a phrase. 3 passes, each one a little looser, a little more convinced by the night's own authority. The 4th pass did not come when it should have. That absence, thin as it was, could have unstrung him. Instead, he listened until the gap felt like permission. He rose without a sound, the discipline of field and shop turning into a different kind of craft, They had rehearsed the route until the words were a spell. Door, hall, stairs, passage by the picture with the ruined frame, back steps, yard. Evelyn went first. Her shoes were wrong for quiet, so she carried them, bare feet learning the boards that creaked and the ones that kept secrets. At the library threshold she paused, not for sentiment but for inventory. Lamp cool, books aligned, the atlas exactly where it ought to be. Let it be said plainly, leaving a life requires a lie. Her lie was neat, a room that could persuade anyone peering in that nothing had happened there. Outdoors, rain did 100 small jobs at once. It blurred edges. It filled prints. It punished lanterns. It drowned dogs' noses and men's thoughts. They accepted its aid and its risks, footing treacherous, visibility mean, and moved the way people move who know the cost of stopping. At the kitchen wall, a shadow detached itself. Carter. No greeting. Time had made courtesies expensive. He took the satchel from her so her hands could be free to balance. They crossed the yard in a slant, not straight to the gate but toward a tool shed first, then sidestepped along the fence where the palmetto cast larger shadows. At the gate, the latch stuck as it always did when damp. He had planned for it. A slim wedge of iron, warmed against his skin so it would not squeal. The latch surrendered. They did not thank it. Beyond the fence, the plantation became what it had always been beneath its performance. A set of distances to be endured. The lane to the road, the ruts that remembered wagons, the ditch where rain gathered its army. Past the cane rows, the world opened into the kind of dark that makes people tell the truth by mistake. When the lightning came, it came low and intimate, white stitches sewing the sky's mouth shut. They reached the small landing before dawn, a place that pretended to be nothing, which is to say, perfect. A riverboat captain with an eye for weather had tied up to ride out the worst of it. His crew smoked in a huddle under the canvas, faces blue in the lightning and yellow in their own small fire. Men who live by water learned to mind their business. They saw a woman with a veil and a man who did not look at anyone long enough to invite questions. Money spoke, not loudly, just correctly. 2 to the city, Carter said, because it had been agreed that he would do the speaking whenever strangers were near. The captain nodded as if he were agreeing to reign. On the river, motion became argument. The house and all its opinions fell behind. The city and all its verdicts came on. Evelyn kept her veil down. Carter sat close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, not in display, but in defense. When the captain watched them, he saw what he wanted to see. A pair kept still by weather, the kind you forget as soon as you dock. When he looked away, they let themselves breathe. 2 careful breaths, not enough to make a story of. By mid-morning, New Orleans rose out of the rain like a rumor proving itself. The docks shouted their commerce in all dialects of need. Between bales and barrels, between men who could sell you anything, and men who could buy your silence at a discount, a path existed that led from being seen to being lost. They walked it. Carter knew which streets to avoid when his skin was the wrong passport, and which to enter when the same fact turned itself into protection. Papers could be sourced. Names could be bent. The city's excess made room, as it always does, for a kind of invisibility. If the chapter ended here, the romance would be too easy. So let the other story arrive, the one that galloped in from the plantation the moment the house realized what it had lost. By noon, the overseer's keys were clattering more loudly than usual. By 2, the parish offices had been troubled. By 3, the first posters were wet on the walls. Missing Mrs. Evelyn Duval, reward. And beneath, in harsher ink, captured dead or alive the Negro man Henry, who has taken her against her will. Men with dogs fanned out as if the land were a table, and they a deck of cards. The Daily Crescent made paragraphs out of pursuit. The Baton Rouge Gazette made a headline out of insult. Girard returned ahead of schedule, dry where the world was wet, his displeasure dressed as paternal concern. He spoke of instability and unhealthy fixations, of libraries and gullible women, of households that suffered when boundaries blurred. He did not speak of bruises or ledger lines that had moved a man like a chess piece and then been surprised when the piece had a mind. Contradictions surfaced at once, as contradictions do when truth is pushed under by force. Rachel, the lady's maid who knew where every ribbon went and how every voice sounded when it thought it was alone, told a quiet truth to a desk with a quill, that her mistress had been packing small and slow for days, the way a person does who is learning stealth as a language. The statement did not survive its next reader, but Sheriff Wilkinson's private notes, unimportant until they weren't, carried the words forward like a smuggled seed. Back at the house, an inventory turned into evidence. Cloth missing, a veil, a measuring rule a carpenter favors, several volumes absent from the French shelf, Rousseau, Voltaire, the very books the papers would later say had taught foolishness to a heart that should have known better than to have one. Gerard called the item stolen, which made the story neater. Stolen things can be returned, chosen things cannot, and the river did its own testifying. A captain, our captain, admitted to seeing a woman in a veil and a man who minded his silence. When asked if the woman seemed under duress, he said, "No more than any woman traveling with a man." The line would be quoted to prove opposite things, which is the job of a good line. New Orleans swallowed them. Whether it spit them out toward Philadelphia, as whispers would later claim, or only held them long enough for hope to become habit, this, for the moment, is beyond the scope of the chapter. What matters here is the pivot itself, a night that promoted a plan into a life, a river that turned a boundary into a road, a city that allowed two people to pass through it like a rumor, loud enough to be believed and soft enough to be denied. By dusk, the plantation was loud with search and righteousness. By dusk, the city had already begun forgetting two faces on a wet morning. In two places at once, one thundering with certainty, one blurred by commerce, the story learned to wear two names, abduction and escape. Each name recruited its own choir. Each name, sung long enough, began to sound like truth. Back in the library, the lamp that had once burned late stood dark by habit. Dust settled on the atlas. A single teacup, cold and ringed at the rim, waited for someone to decide whether to clear it or to keep it as a relic. Somewhere on the river, a wake widened and then closed. Somewhere in a city that speaks every language for sale, two people stepped from one grammar to another. Night, which had chosen them, did not offer epilogue. It offered only this, distance, and the promise that distance can be both salvation and peril. The dogs kept running, the posters kept bleeding ink, and the rain, finished with its useful work, drifted off as if it had never been the loudest voice in the room. New Orleans swallowed them the way it swallows everything. Noise first, then names, then the edges of whatever is trying to keep its shape. Docks clanged. Markets bargained. Rain steamed off brick and skin. If two figures stepped ashore with a satchel labeled binding cloth and a veil that turned a face into a rumor, the city did what it does best. It let them become ordinary. Ordinary is a kind of cloak. It lets a man stand in a doorway long enough to learn the traffic of a street without being counted. It lets a woman buy thread and vinegar and a newspaper and fold each into the other until none look like evidence. Carter had learned to move as if he belonged to the ground he stepped on. Evelyn learned faster than she feared she could. There were neighborhoods where his color drew heat, and others where it was cover. There were corners where her accent marked her as a visitor, and others where it vanished in the clatter. Between the two of them, a path braided itself. Not straight, never safe, but real. They found a room that wasn't theirs yet. Money makes honesty affordable. They paid in advance and asked for nothing but a lock that held and a window that opened. The landlady made a show of not asking questions. "River brings all sorts," she said, and counted the coins twice. At night, they rehearsed the next steps in voices the walls could not gather. Who to ask about papers without sounding like someone who needed them. Which church to sit in if you wanted to overhear the business of leaving, without being accused of trying to leave. By morning, the posters were up, in muddy alleys and bright squares, on tavern doors and courthouse boards. The story repeated itself in a typeface that pretended to be the truth. Missing, Mrs. Evelyn Duval. Reward for her safe return. Beneath it, in a blacker hand that tried to make outrage look like justice, capture, dead or alive, the Negro man Henry, who has taken her against her will. A whole narrative tucked into one sentence, cruel and convenient. The parish did not simply adopt the story, it rehearsed it. Girard, dried and composed, presented grief that had been ironed. To the sheriff he described literature as a fever that ruins judgment. To acquaintances he called Henry by every name but his own, the boy, the servant, the animal, as if renaming could disprove the fact of a mind. He spoke of his wife as if she were a myth that had betrayed him, a dutiful woman led astray by the unnatural pretensions of a slave. The words traveled as tidy lies do, faster than rainwater. Contradictions walked alongside. Rachel, who knew the drag and lift of every fabric in that house, told the parish something small and explosive, that her mistress had been packing carefully, like a person learning a new alphabet of leaving, one stocking from a drawer, one veil folded flat, the odd coin tucked into hems that prayer could not reach. Her statement was taken, then stricken, ink made to behave as if truth were a stain that could be lifted with the right solution. Sheriff Wilkinson copied it into his private notes before it disappeared, a small act of memory smuggled under the law's nose. The riverboat captain did not help anyone's comfort. Questioned, he said what he had seen. A woman under a dark veil, a man who kept his eyes steady and his hands still. When asked if the woman seemed in distress, he gave a line that newspapers love because it can carry any meaning, no more than any woman traveling with a man. The sentence did not break. People bent it until it fit the hope they preferred. The city's network, a braid of churches, printers, washerwomen, boatmen, barbers, and men who could make a letter look older than it was, began to whisper its offers. There were papers that could say a person was someone else. There were ships that could forget a passenger. There were streets that remained narrower on maps than in life, because the men who drew them did not live where the width widened. Philadelphia, someone said, not because it was safe, nowhere was, but because it was far enough and loud enough that two lives could tuck themselves into its noise without being asked to pay in blood. Canada, someone added softly, because sometimes the end of one sentence needs a country to guard it. In June, the gossip that had been shamed into silence found a second wind. The Picayune hinted, as papers will when they want a scandal without the liability. Sources near the Duval household suggested that the marriage had been troubled from its inception. The word cruelty never appeared, but everyone read it anyway. Girard blustered threats of suit. The paper found safer adjectives. The story retreated to the convenient morality of abduction. Meanwhile, the library back at the plantation turned its absence into an accusation. An inventory discovered missing not just a veil and a handful of clothes, but a group of books that behaved like accomplices. Rousseau, Voltaire, a travel guide marked where a river forks north. Girard called the title stolen, which was comfortable. Theft suggests the thing might be returned. The overseer called the pattern insolence. Rachel called it preparation and said no more. By July, the search parties were hunting proof more than people. Dogs ran along the river's edge until the scent dissolved into the city's stew. Men swore they'd seen the couple in Baton Rouge, in Biloxi, in a dream that told them what they wanted to be paid to repeat. A rumor grew in ocean and announced Haiti as destination, but shipping records, once men bothered to look, did not back the boast. The trail did not so much go cold as go crowded. Too many footsteps pretended to be theirs. New Orleans taught them the arithmetic of risk. Daylight meant commerce and faces. Night meant shadows and the danger of being the wrong kind of silhouette to the wrong kind of man. They moved at the pace of caution, which is slower than hope but steadier. Churches offered pews where a person could listen without being asked to explain hunger. A printer's boy delivered a parcel at dusk. A psalm book that was not a psalm book, its binding thick with more paper than prayer required. Inside, names that could be learned, dates that could be lived with, a route that preferred rain. They did not romanticize. Evelyn learned that freedom had errands, laundry, rent, markets that did not haggle with pity. Henry learned that courage has bills. You pay in small humiliations and sometimes in blood. They made mistakes a married couple might make. Two people unused to deciding every minute for themselves, without the scaffold of a house that tells you when to sit, when to stand, when to breathe. They argued softly, not about whether to go on, but about how to remain unseen long enough to go on. The city kept testing them. A constable stared too long. A boy pointed. A woman looked twice and then chose, mercifully, to look away. Twice they moved rooms in a single week, because the street outside learned their footsteps too quickly. Once, when a door they trusted didn't open, they slept in a church vestibule while a storm scoured the flagstones, and the priest pretended not to notice two souls who had come for sanctuary of a different kind. At the plantation, the performance of grief soured into assertion. Gerard, finding that certainty played better than sorrow, sold the story the parish wanted to buy. Civilization under siege. A lady compromised. A household robbed. Men nodded because nodding confirmed who they were. Women nodded because not nodding carried a cost. The land itself, cane rising and bowing under weather, kept working as land will, unfussed by the drama of its owners. By late summer, the hunt had thinned, as all hunts do when attention tires. The reward notices curled on their nails. The sheriff's desk found tasks that yielded answers. The house's lamp resumed its early bedtime, as if to advertise that nothing extraordinary had ever happened beneath its shade. Only Rachel kept setting one extra cup on the pantry shelf, and only Margaret kept a page in her journal for a day when the right kind of word might be returned to her. Two stories took root and began to grow with the persistence of weeds. One declared abduction because it excused the world. A wicked man, a weak woman, no system indicted, no conscience required. The other murmured escape because it comforted the ache. Love, courage, a river as road. Each recruited its own choir. Each shushed the facts that did not fit its harmony. The truth, which prefers difficult chords, continued on foot, largely unaccompanied. In the room that was briefly theirs, they divided the future into measurable tasks. Carter bartered repairs for information, mending a chair leg here, rehanging a door there, while his ears gathered names of people who could turn Henry into Harold without making a mess of the ink. Evelyn copied addresses twice and burned the drafts. They practiced answers to questions that had not yet been asked. Charleston, she would say when a place of birth was required, which was not a lie and also not the whole story. Carpenter, he would answer when a trade was demanded, which was the whole story and also a declaration. On a morning that smelled of hot iron and chicory, they met a man whose business card did not say what he did. He took one look at Carter's hands and named the city that would take them if they could take themselves there. Philadelphia, he said, as if he were prescribing a tonic. A crowd that minds its own business and a church that minds yours. He wrote a date as if he were blessing it. He wrote a street as if he were drawing a door. He folded the paper once, twice, and made it disappear into the psalm book, where the prayers now had company. They did not go that day or the next. They learned from rain. Wait until it makes everything look like everything else. When weather agreed, they went down to the river again. Not to leave immediately, but to learn which boat slept where, which captains drank too clean to sell a passenger's shadow, which deckhands talked too much to be trusted. New Orleans, having swallowed them, taught them how to pass through its gut without being digested. Behind them, the parish began the work of forgetting by filing. The official record tightened itself into a thin folder, a missing person report, a handful of clippings, the arithmetic of a reward. What did not fit in the folder fell into other containers. Kitchen talk, field murmurs, a letter someone kept where the law would not look. Memory, being wilder than law, stored what it pleased. If there is a single sentence that belongs to this chapter, it is not a declaration but a hinge. The trail did not end. It subdivided. The city gave them the tools to choose which branch to take, and the chance, only a chance, to survive the choosing. The plantation, in turn, gave itself the relief of a story that kept its hands clean. Between those two mercies, the people at the center did the only thing people like them can do. They kept moving, they kept listening, and they pretended long enough to become the names the world would let them use. Night came easier by September. The air lost its fever. The streets remembered how to cool. In their room, they slept on top of the coverlet, as fugitives do, ready to leave the shape of their bodies in the bed and take their lives with them. The psalm book lay open on the small table, a strand of hair marking a page that was not a psalm at all, but a map written without rivers or roads. Only days, only hours, only the courage to move when the hour arrived. Outside, The river turned and turned, practicing eternity. Inside, they practiced something briefer and, for them, more urgent. A new beginning shaped like a departure. The plan required 3 things the world refused them by law: names, passage, and luck. New Orleans could counterfeit the first 2. The third had to be coaxed. They left before dawn on a day chosen for its ugliness. Low sky, slow rain, a wind that kept honest men indoors and dishonest men yawning. The psalm book rode inside Evelyn's cloak, heavier than prayer should be. Inside it, a slip of paper folded to near nothing. A street in Philadelphia that knew how to hold its tongue. And 2 names that would be theirs if they could keep them: Ellen and Harold. The boat north didn't ask questions so much as prices. Porters moved like punctuation, stops and commas that separated people who could be read from those who wished to pass unnoticed. Carter kept the satchel close and his head lower. Evelyn learned a new way to be looked at, not as ornament, not as property, but as uncertainty, someone the city had not decided whether to help or to harm. River gave way to gulf, then river again, then rails that stitched the states together with a noisy, smoking thread. They had chosen the kind of route that makes capture inconvenient. No single clear line to follow, only connections, changes, rooms rented by the night where the walls minded their business. Stations brought questions in uniforms. "Ma'am, your destination." "Sir, your papers?" The phrase had become a ritual. They performed it with the careful ease of people who know a stumble is not a small thing. Evelyn, Ellen, learned to answer in thirds. 1 part truth, Charleston. 1 part practiced vagueness, visiting a cousin. 1 part silence that dared the question to ask again. Carter, Harold, let trade speak for him when it could. A bent nail straightened in a porter's palm. A suitcase hinge coaxed back to duty, in the time it takes a whistle to sound. Each small fix an argument for being ignored. Men forgive utility faster than they forgive audacity. They arrived in Philadelphia, under a sky the color of pewter. Streets were narrower than New Orleans, but full in a different way. Quaker plainness that hid brisk ambition. Abolitionist zeal braided with fatigue. Churches that hummed with hymns and with instructions disguised as mercy. A door opened at the address inside the psalm book. A woman with a shawl and a stern mouth ushered them through a hallway that smelled of starch and tallow. "You'll call me Mrs. Price," she said, which was likely not her name. "You'll stay 2 nights. You'll leave before sunup on the 3rd. If anyone asks, you are cousins. If anyone insists, you are mute." Price's house was a ledger of errands performed against a law that made kindness contraband. Men came at odd hours. Women left with packets concealed in bread loaves and sewing baskets. In whispers that had learned to be clear, the house taught its rules. Do not draw a map. Do not keep a list. Do not say underground as if the name made you brave. "Freedom is not a story," Mrs. Price said, not unkindly. "It is a route, and roots are muscle and memory." Harold found work in a day. He always did where wood and need coexisted. A joiner on Vine Street needed hands that could read a warped board and tell whether it wanted heat or patience. Payment came small, honest, and in cash. Ellen learned the market's temper. Which stalls haggled in good faith, which peered too long at her face as if rearranging its assumptions. She bought bread by halves, eggs by 3s, thread by the yard, arranging scarcity into meals the way she had once arranged guests into evenings. Fear in Philadelphia was different, quieter, more educated. In the South, danger wore a whip and a badge. Here it wore paper and precedent. Men in clean coats discussed property in tones that tried to sound like philosophy. The word fugitive entered rooms like a draft and stayed. Church basements taught the counter-grammar, papers that argued back, sermons with footnotes that reached toward Canada when the law reached toward bodies. Ellen sat under those rafters and felt both seen and conscripted. They married in October of that year, in a sanctuary that understood discretion as a sacrament. The minister's hands barely trembled. The congregation was 2 witnesses who would not sign their names, but would remember the hour. Ellen's veil was simple now, a plain cloth meant to mark solemnity rather than evade scrutiny. Harold watched the door even as he said his vows, a habit that would follow him into any happiness he could afford. The ring, if you can call it that, was a loop of brass polished to resemble promise. Afterward, Mrs. Price allowed herself one indulgence, a small smile that remained on her face for the span of a hymn. They did not take a honeymoon. They took shifts. Harold hammered and planed in a shop that smelled of sap and heat, and the owner learned to speak of him with the fond exasperation reserved for men who fix more than they are paid to. Ellen took work mending and occasionally reading letters aloud for neighbors whose eyes had been denied schooling. She learned to temper her Charleston vowels, to file them smooth until sir and ma'am belonged on this street. Too, winter taught them the city's cruelty. Not men with dogs, but cold that punished oversight and hunger that came back even after you fed it. They survived by arithmetic, coal measured by the hour of warmth it bought, candles supposed to last a week stretched to 10 days, a dinner kept simple because a knock might come that would ask for half of it. The psalm book remained on a shelf that looked accidental. Inside it, the slip of paper that had brought them here now shared space with others. Receipts, a list of names paired with trades, a fragment of a prayer that asked not for deliverance, but for notice, the law notice first. In 1850, Congress stretched a hand southward and northward both, passing a statute that made the whole country a hunting ground. The Fugitive Slave Act found them in their kitchen like a draft that would not be sealed. Neighbors whispered new protocols: keep a bag ready, do not open doors at night, teach the children not to answer when strangers speak their names. A knock one evening did not become a raid because the men outside wanted coin more than righteousness. The second knock, months later, ended with a neighbor boy, too brave, too angry, bleeding from the mouth where a badge had struck his question back down his throat. Canada, Mrs. Price said, as if the syllables themselves created distance. The church network shifted its roots northward. Maps changed hands without ever touching a table. Men learned the names of towns you could not find on a printed atlas. Women learned to pack for a journey that would have to be survived, not enjoyed. Ellen tightened the seam of her courage and asked what could be carried that would not betray them if they were searched. Words, Price said, and not written ones. Harold hesitated. He had built something that almost looked like a life. Customers who asked for him by name. A shop window project that made passers-by nod. A friend who had a laugh like a hammer striking true. The thought of dismantling it gnawed at him the way a bad tooth will ruin the taste of even good bread. But the law had a new appetite, and his skin could not be mistaken for anything the law wanted to protect. He packed his tools, the ones that said who he was when names were unsafe, and left the rest to memory. Before they left, they did one thing the law would not have granted, but the church did. They sat for a record that would not live in any official ledger. The minister wrote a line in his private book: husband protective, wife soft-spoken, fear evident, and closed it as if sealing a letter he could not entrust to the postal service. He had already learned how to write for posterity and hide for the present. They traveled by night and by invitation. A barn off a road that had no number. A canal fence where a woman with a lantern coughed twice to mean safe, and once to mean hide. A station where the timetable did not print their train because their train was a cart, and the conductor a farmer who never went to bed angry. In northern towns, men who claimed neutrality offered rooms under roofs that sagged, and women who claimed piety quietly pressed bread and news into Ellen's hands. The map through New York and into the next country did not rely on ink. It relied on a choir of small, brave gestures humming the same unprinted hymn. At the border, the last fear did something impolite. It refused to end. Expectation had promised a line you cross and then breathe. Reality offered a river crossed in a small boat and a winter that bit as hard on one bank as the other. The first Canadian church was cold. The faces were kind and tired. Papers here mattered differently, but they still mattered. Men with clipboards replaced men with dogs. So they paused. They did not declare victory. They declared fatigue. In Montreal, for a time measured by receipts that have long since browned to unreadable, they rented a room above a shop that sold gloves and ribbons. Harold found work quickly. Wood is a language the world speaks everywhere. Ellen translated her old life into something that did not depend on mirrors. Laundry, teaching a neighbor child her letters, copying recipes from a French newspaper, and laughing when the measurements betrayed her. There are endings that look like beginnings until you squint. Perhaps this was one. Perhaps the rumor was true. A registry entry with names close enough to theirs to make a stranger weep. A child's cough that took too long to cure. A doctor who wrote a note in the margin of a certificate because grief makes archivists of ordinary men. Or perhaps the story bent another way. Perhaps a letter reached them. Gerard's family sounding out the geography of shame, and fear changed its name to caution again. For now, the chapter stops shy of verdict. What it can say is this: they traveled farther than anyone in that library had permission to imagine. They stitched identities from paper and will. They made themselves ordinary on purpose until they almost believed it. And if years later, records in distant rooms would claim an Ellen and a Harold stood together before a stranger and agreed to share a name, then that too is a kind of proof, less than a photograph, more than a rumor, that two people once insisted on being persons in a world organized to prevent it. Philadelphia kept their ghost addresses. New Orleans kept their footprints in the rain. The plantation kept its story like a wound it would not let scab. North of a line that maps draw boldly and memory draws faint, a carpenter's rule and a pearl comb may have found a drawer that closed at last without fear of someone else's key. The official story hardened fast and thin. Poster ink, sheriff's ledger, a newspaper's certainty. After that, time did what time does. It filed, it lost, it lied by omission. The Duval house burned in 1849. A neat column blaming lightning for what the land would later suggest was intention. Gerard sold, sailed, and styled his grief into exile. The parish learned to pronounce the word abduction, with the confidence of men who prefer tidy crimes to untidy histories. Yet the past is a poor sleeper. It keeps turning over, exposing fragments. In 1858, workmen renovating a French Quarter townhouse found a tin box tucked into a wall like a confession. Water-blackened pages of a journal marked only E. The writing, dated by scholars to the mid-1840s, read like the secret spine of a story the South refused to shelve. A husband who loved his books more than their reader. A literate carpenter whose knowledge had learned to travel without papers. A plan that turned rain and river into a route. The last entry did not end. It lifted unfinished, like a breath held too long. Archivists published fragments. Critics sniffed forgery. Others argued that the ink and paper had no reason to lie. The journal did not settle the matter. It pried it back open. Philadelphia, for its part, kept quieter records, the kind that insist on humanity but whisper it. In 1847, a church ledger recorded a marriage between Ellen Davis and Harold Carter, both free colored persons. The minister's private note was too human to be legal. The woman speaks with a southern accent. The husband watches the door. Directories listed a modest carpentry business on a 7th Ward street that remembered free black industry, even when the nation forgot it. Then came 1850, and with it a law that taught the North to hunt. Names thinned. A household moved or vanished, as if obeying a command they had rehearsed for years. Canada. Back in Louisiana, the land kept its own archive, the stubborn kind that requires shovels instead of citations. In 1966, beneath the footprint of the old house, surveyors found the bones of a root cellar and 3 small survivors of a life: a pearl comb, a carpenter's measuring rule scratched HC, and the torn skin of a letter addressed to my dearest E. The ink had run, but the threat had not. Cannot delay. He suspects, sooner see you dead than... The sentence broke where the fire had eaten it. The meaning did not. Oral history took its turn. A woman named Martha Johnson, born into slavery on a neighboring place, told researchers the story her grandmother had told her. Notes hidden in book bindings. A master who found one. A cellar door that learned to speak at 3 a.m. in a voice only guilt can hear. Across the parish, elders repeated twin endings like an old hymn with a contested last verse. They ran. They were buried, and nobody willing to concede the melody to the other. The state tried to adjudicate memory with committees. 2005-07 review brought historians, archaeologists, and forensic skeptics into one room and asked them to weigh the weightless. The majority opinion, cautious and grave, suggested that Evelyn and Henry likely died on or near the property in April 1847, their absence curated into abduction to spare a planter's standing. The minority insisted that paper trails in Philadelphia and whispers in Montreal made a corridor wide enough for survival. The report did not so much conclude as choose a posture, one hand open to doubt, the other gripping the safer story. Science, ever late to the seance, arrived with machines. Early ground-penetrating radar in the 1980s mapped anomalies like swallowed rooms. 2002 hydrological study cored the soil and found, layered deep, the signatures of accelerants and traces that suggested human remains fragmented by fire and time. In 2013, better radar sketched a small structure 30 yards off the main foundation, a possible storage cellar, undocumented in plantation records. Floods erased the landmark before a spade could confirm a rumor. The river, ally and witness, declined to testify further. Then there were the papers that behaved like postcards from a life someone almost had time to finish. In 1991, a Parisian cousin opened a family journal and found Gerard writing in 1851 that they say she has been seen in Montreal, and in 1857 that he woke nightly at the hour of the cellar door. Was it obsession without object, or an oblique confession in a language that could not bear the nouns? Scholars parsed verbs. The dead, as usual, declined edits. Montreal added a final ache. In a small museum's archive, a death certificate dated 1862 recorded Ellen Carter, née Davis, approximately 40, Southern United States, by birth. The margin bore a doctor's human note. Patient requested certain items be preserved for the historical record, journal and pearl comb. Husband adamant these remain private. No such items surfaced. Perhaps privacy kept its promise. Perhaps flood and mildew fulfilled their office. Meanwhile, the living made meanings. A 2010 documentary chose the mercy of romance and filmed a North where snow sanctifies. Novels bent the facts toward catharsis, as art will when history refuses. The Parish Historical Society mounted a small exhibit that refused to choose. Evelyn's reproduced portrait. Dark hair, eyes fixed on something just beyond the painter. Beside an empty frame labeled Henry Carter. No surviving image. Visitors stood longer before the blankness than the face, as if the absence did more work than any brush could. Work crews who tried to tame the site in the 1970s turned in puzzled reports, tools wandering, cold that pooled without breeze, a smell of smoke when weather swore innocence. Their company cited environmental concerns and abandoned the project. A folk explanation took the easy path, haunting because it is simpler to name a shiver than a system. Scientists chalked phenomena up to suggestion, microclimates, the swamp's choir of trickster noises. Both parties, if they were honest, admitted the place has a way of making the present feel watched. At last, in 2021, a modest marker appeared near the presumed foundation, a compromise between certainty and decency. No names, no verdict. Only this. For those who sought freedom by whatever path was offered, their story continues. People come. They read the single sentence. Some leave flowers. Some leave nothing and carry something away anyway. On April evenings, if rain starts without hurry, listeners say the wind learns two voices, one Charleston soft, one carpenter steady, discussing logistics as if love were a plan you could execute with care. So which ending belongs to them? The archive offers three and the land refuses to choose. They escaped and grew into new names, new winters, perhaps children who learned to call safety a country. They were caught, and the house that taught obedience taught erasure one final time. They split the difference, one crossing, one buried, a story halved and still somehow whole. The truest sentence may be the one that will not help a courtroom. Both are possible. In a nation built to guarantee one kind of freedom and ration another, lives often resolve into plural truths. The pearl comb and the carpenter's rule lie to no one. The ledger entries do not blush. The psalm book, if it survives somewhere, still weighs more than paper should. Memory, which answers to neither sheriff nor scholar, keeps insisting that the boundary between legend and record is not a wall but a marsh. Treacherous, fertile, echoing. Stand there, at the edge of what was once the Duval place, on an April night when rain begins politely and then decides. The cypress lean like elders, The grass holds its breath. If you hear anything, call it weather. If you hear more, call it history practicing the courage to speak. And if you hear two voices, low and urgent, speaking not of romance but of roots, doors, stairs, yard, gate, landing, river, allow the possibility that love in that time and place sounded exactly like a plan. The file in the courthouse remains thin. The story in the air remains thick. Between them, a nation's long argument with itself goes on, about ownership and personhood, law and mercy, remembrance and forgetting. Evelyn and Henry, whether buried beneath the house that kept them or buried in names they chose, are still at the center of it, refusing to be only objects or only ghosts. They are stubbornly persons, claiming a chapter the official record tried to close with a single word: missing.